All right. We're going to look at Judges chapter 4 and 5 today. And if we remember, the first couple chapters of Judges started off with a recap of mostly the conquest in Joshua. And then most of chapter 3 of Judges, we saw Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar. The first 3 judges, or the first 2 and 1 maybe. And we also settled into our cycles of apostasy that the whole book will follow. Today, we're going to be reading chapters 4 and 5 and mostly studying Deborah, the next judge. And when we look back on this story from the New Testament, from Hebrews, we'll see that Barak is the one mentioned and not Deborah. And that's mostly just because of the patriarchal society. But Deborah was the leader at this time, and that's what we're going to study. But to recap, the cycles that we found last week and that we will continue to find through the whole book. The first part is Israel will turn their back on God and fall into apostasy. We'll see that over and over again. And apostasy, we'll remember, is idolatry mostly. They'll start serving the Canaanite gods, the Baals, and Ashtoreth. After they fall into apostasy, God allows them to be oppressed by any neighboring nation, whichever one's picked at that time. There's a bunch of them that will take turns oppressing the Israelites. And after the oppression reaches a certain point, the Israelites will cry out to God to help them, to relieve the pressure of the oppression. God will hear them, and number 4, he will raise up a judge to deliver the nation from their oppressors, and they'll go back to serving him. But whenever that judge dies, every time Israel falls back into apostasy, and we start the cycle again. So chapter 3 ended. It said there's peace in the land. So we are on this list, we are in the area in between number 4 and number 5 right now. We have a judge that delivered the nation, but that judge is still alive. So they are still serving the Lord. So maybe this time they'll be obedient, maybe not. So Judges, we're going to, like I said, our reading is going to be in chapters 4 and 5, but we're going to start off looking at a couple verses from last week in chapter 3. So verse 11, it says, "Then the land was quiet for 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died." So we remember the first judge, Othniel. If 40 does represent the time of testing, like it does through most of Scripture, and we see in chapter 3 that they had peace for 40 years, and then that judge died. It seems like that peace was a time of testing to see how they would behave once the judge died. We see again in verse 30, it says, "So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was quiet for 80 years. So it seems like the end of chapter 3, there was a double time of trial, or a time of testing. And that might be because the first 40-year period, the first time of testing, maybe they passed that and did well, and were given another 40 years of peace to see how they would do at the end of that. And as we see when we start in chapter 4, they didn't do well. So chapter 4, verse 1, this is after the 80 years of peace under Ehud and Shamgar. It says, "Then the sons of Israel again did what was evil in the eyes of Yahweh. Now Ehud had died." So we see again, once one of the judges dies, whoever the current one is at that time, then we will have the statement that Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they did it again, and now they're back into apostasy. Verse 2, because of that, verse 2, "And Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and the commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim." So Jabin doesn't seem like it's a personal name. Jabin is a title like Pharaoh. We also see Ramses, multiple different Ramses sharing that name, multiple Abimelechs. So it's what they call a dynastic name. that family name would rule, or that title would just stay with whoever the leader was at the time. So we have Jabin, the king of Canaan, who may or may not actually be named Jabin, but the title is Jabin. All right. But the main story here, we're following his head general, which is Sisera. We move to verse 3. Then the sons of Israel cried out to Yahweh, for he had 900 iron chariots, and he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. So keep in mind what time period we're in. This is just the very beginning of the Iron Age. This is old times, right? There's not a lot of different kinds of weaponry. The Israelites have swords and probably clubs, but we see that in verse 3, we're told that Sisera, who was the commander of the army of Jabin, the king of Canaan, Sisera had 900 iron chariots. The Israelites have swords and clubs, and this army has 900 iron chariots. So how do you fight against chariots with swords and clubs? You don't do well anyways, right? So we're going to notice a couple things here. The judgment is longer. Again, it went from 8 years, the judgment, the first one, to 18 years. And now this one was 20 years. And that says the end of verse 3. This time he oppressed the sons of Israel severely for 20 years. So this is also the first time that it's mentioned that the oppression is severe. So they keep being oppressed for longer times. It seems like the severity of the oppression is getting worse. And now the oppressors have chariots, and they have a lot of them. So the Israelites probably would have been intimidated, like I said, with swords and clubs to fight against horsemen and chariots. And if anybody's old enough to have seen Ben-Hur, maybe just one or two of us, we understand how strong chariots are in fights. People that aren't in chariots don't do well against people that are in chariots. Right. So the Israelites they would have felt overpowered. So they're down in the dumps again. They've apostatized. They're being oppressed severely. They're out-armed, out-militaried. And we move to verse 4. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. And she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel came up to her for judgment. A couple things we're going to notice right off the bat. We now have a female judge, and she is also a prophetess. Both are mentioned a lot of times during Bible studies. We don't see a lot of female prophetesses, but we do see a handful, and we're going to go over those here shortly. Deborah, Miriam, if we remember, Moses and Aaron's sister, was also a prophetess. Huldah was a prophetess, and Anna was a prophetess. So we know this is not a singular case, although it's rare. There are plenty of female prophetesses, and we also know that this is a position that carries on into the new covenant. Women prophets is not something just of the past. We have no reason to think that they cannot still now be prophets. One other thing we notice is Deborah's the only female judge. There's not a lot of political leaders that are also prophets. So Deborah is kind of a rare example for that. Although she's also the only judge that was not also the military leader. So she was the political leader and a prophet, but the military leader was Barak. And we'll get into that also. Verse 5 says she used to sit under the palm tree of Deborah. So she had her own palm tree named after her. So everybody must have known where she would be. She would be under her own tree. And we do also have a lot of links, especially in the Old Testament, but some in the New Testament, a lot of links between trees and divine encounters. So a lot of times when people talk to God, it is near or under or in relation to a tree. See the burning bush, see Jesus seeing the apostles under the tree. There's a lot of examples. Trees are involved a lot. So she didn't lead the military. Verse 6. Then she sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kadesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded, go and march to Mount Tabor and take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and from the sons of Zebulun, and I will draw out to you Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his many troops to the river Kishon, and I will give him into your hand. So we gather a couple things from this. In verse 6, how she words it, how Deborah words this to Barak, is that it seems like he's already been told what to do, because she says, hasn't Yahweh, the God of Israel, commanded? And then explains what he's already commanded. So it seems like he already knows this, but now he knows that she knows too. So she's reminding him, it seems like, that you were commanded by God to go do this thing. Also notice that in verse 7, God says, I will draw out to you Sisera. So he just wants Barak to take the 10,000 soldiers there, and then the Lord is going to bring out Sisera and his army to meet them there. And it says at the end of verse 7, I, the Lord, will give him into your hand. So this is going to be another one of those battles where God is arranging everything. All the Israelites have to do is obey, and it's a victory. Verse 8, Barak, maybe the bravest man in all of Israel, says, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. So Barak, who is going to lead the nation's military, will go if the prophetess goes with him. But if the woman does not go with him, he will not go. So he's as brave as it gets, we see. Verse 9, so she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on the journey that you are about to take, for Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. So Barak says he's not, even though he acknowledges that God has told him to gather up these soldiers and to fight Sisera, he's not going to go unless Deborah also goes. So that's a strike against Barak. But Deborah did go, so Barak went. But that choice to not go without her is what caused verse 9 to say that Barak will not get any honor from this victory, and that Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And what we might think, if it's our first time going through, that woman is probably Deborah. That's the only one that we've met so far in relation to this story. So when it says that Yahweh will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman, we might think that woman's Deborah, but it's not. It's a different one. So these two chapters, we're going to notice a theme of weak men being led by strong women. So this is it's an interesting passage, and a lot of people like it for that reason. Verse 10. Then Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali together to Kadesh. These were the tribes, so not those two gentlemen. They've been dead for quite some time. He's talking about the tribes. Barak called those two tribes to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him, and Deborah also went with him. Now Heber, the Kenite, had separated himself from the Kenites. If we remember Heber, this is going to be Moses's... Not Heber, I'm sorry, Hobab. Hobab would have been Moses's brother-in-law. And I realize that some of the translations say father-in-law. It's the same word for both, but we know his father-in-law was Jethro. We studied that earlier. So it says, Heber the Kenite had separated himself from the Kenites, from the sons of Hobab, the brother-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oak in Zananim, which is near Kadesh. Then they told Sisera that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera called together all his chariots, 900 iron chariots, and all the people who were with him from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. So what happened is they tell Sisera. Sisera finds out that Barak has put together this army and that they've moved the army up to Mount Tabor. So Sisera is going to gather his army and go to meet Barak's army at Mount Tabor. Sisera doesn't know, but we assume that Barak does, what Deborah already said, which was that God was going to call Sisera out to meet them. So Sisera went out to meet them, but he didn't realize that he went out because God led him out there. Now, he's going out and he's got all these chariots, but what good do chariots do if Barak's army is already on Mount Tabor? They're not going to take chariots up a mountain to fight, right? So Barak and his group, his army, his 10,000 men have the high ground over the chariots. It is the only advantageous ground that you can have over chariots, is to be up a mountain above them. But they didn't use it. Verse 14, and Deborah said to Barak, "Arise, for this is the day in which Yahweh has given Sisera into your hand. Has not Yahweh gone out before you?" So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. So what we see is Barak gave up the high ground, gave up the advantageous ground, and came down off of the mountain to meet the chariots, to fight in the valley. We know from that Barak has gotten over his kind of his weakness. It would take a good amount of faith and confidence to come down off of the high ground to fight the chariots face to face. There's no explanation for that other than he did believe that God did give them that victory. So he went down to meet Sisera and his army in the plains. And then verse 15, and Yahweh threw Sisera and all his chariots and all his camp into confusion with the edge of the sword before Barak. And Sisera came down from his chariot and fled away on foot. Okay, so if you're in a chariot, basically it's a giant, it's a tank. For those days, it is a tank. It's fully armored on the front and the sides. The only part that's not armored is on the back where they get on. So they have these armored fighting units, these chariots. Why would the general come out of his chariot and flee on foot? It says at the end of verse 15, he fled away on foot. He left his chariot and fled away. Why in the world would you leave your chariot and run away? We'll answer that. The next chapter will explain it. But basically what it comes down to is God caused all of this confusion for Sisera's army, but he also caused a little bit of a flood, and he caused the banks of the Kishon River to overflow. And when that happens, the mud makes chariots useless. Now you have an unstoppable fighting machine that can't even move. Because the wheels get stuck in the mud. And he would have had the heaviest chariot, since he was the general. He would have had the big, gaudy, the just huge, way past the point of being efficient, just something so everybody would recognize that he's the one with authority. He would have the mightiest appearing chariot, right? So it would get stuck first because it would be the heaviest. Verse 16, but Barak pursued the chariots and all those in the camp as far as Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the camp of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not even one remained. So the panic in the mud made the Canaanite soldiers easy targets, right? Sisera had to come down from his and run away. And again, we think that's because it would have got stuck first, being the heaviest and largest. Or it could have been if one of the people under his command would have fled and run away, he would have likely just killed them outright. But when the general himself's running, who's in a higher authority to kill him for abandoning the fight, right? So we see that the rest of the chariots, not Sisera's chariots, tried to leave, and Barak chased them down and killed all of the soldiers. It says not even one remained. Verse 17, now Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between them, or between Jabin the king of Hazor and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, turn aside, my master, turn aside to me. don't be afraid. And he turned aside to her into the tent, and she covered him with a rug. Then he said to her, please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty. So she opened a bottle of milk and gave him a drink. And then she covered him. And he said to her, stand in the doorway of the tent, and if anyone comes and asks of you and says, is there a man here? You will say no. So Sisera expected to be safe, right, with Jael, because it says in verse 17 that Sisera and Jael's husband, their clan, they had an alliance. So they were allies. So they obviously already knew each other before this, because they both recognized each other when she came out. And when she said turn aside and invited him into her tent, he knew her, she knew him. His guard went down and he went in there to hide. So she covers him. At the end of verse 18, she covered him up. We have a couple different reasons why she would cover him up. One, it would make Sisera feel safe and relaxed. It would help him sleep. He's on the run. He's running for his life from this battle. He sees somebody that's familiar that he's not an enemy with. So he goes in there to hide, and then she offers to cover him up. So it seems good. The same with her choice of milk. He asked her for water because he was thirsty. She gave him milk. Why would she give him milk instead of water? Maybe they didn't have clean water, but it seems like the milk was on purpose. Reason number one, it would seem like an upgrade, like Sisera is an important person. So instead of giving him water, you would splurge and give him the better treatment, the milk. But the other half of that coin is the milk's also going to help him sleep better, which seems to be what she's aiming for here. And then it would be the way the tents were set up. We're not talking about a pop-up tent that kids might put outside for just them sleeping alone overnight. These tents were tent structures, right? So they have different rooms inside the tent. And the women's room is the inner room, the furthermost inside of the tent, because the men would be on the outside. They would guard anybody entering the tent, and they would also give the permission for who would come and go from the inner room. So Jair would have had Sisera in the inner room, in her room, on the inside of the structure. And then he told her that while he was sleeping in her room, for her to go into the doorway of the main tent. That way, if anybody goes by and says, hey, have you seen this guy we're chasing? And she's supposed to say, no, I haven't seen anybody. And they were not allowed. So even though they could peek their head in and look inside the tent, they were not allowed for any reason to look into the inner rooms of the tent without the man of the house's permission. And since we don't know where Jael's husband is, nobody can give that permission to search that inside room. So if she says there's nobody there, nobody's allowed to look. And that's what Sisera was banking on. And so verse 21, then Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg or a tent stake and placed a hammer in her hand and went secretly or quietly to him and drove the peg into his temple, and it went through into the ground, for he was sound asleep and exhausted. So he died. Yeah, I guess he did. So when it says that she went secretly to him or softly to him, it's saying that she's moving quietly so as not to wake him up. She already covered him with a blanket. She already gave him some milk. She clearly wants him to just take a nap so that she can do what she needs to do. And what that was involved driving a tent stake.
Why, if they were friends, or if there was peace between them? Why?
There was peace between her husband's clan and him. But it seems like Jael was aware of Yahweh, the God of Israel, in that her alliance with Sisera was in violation to what Yahweh wanted. So it's similar to what we see in Rahab. Why did Rahab help the Israelites? Because God wanted her to. So that we're not told that, but it seems that she was definitely being led to do that. I did during the study. There were multiple different people that mentioned that it could have been that since Sisera went into her tent, she was afraid that he was going to violate her there. So when he fell asleep, she killed him before he woke up and had the chance to do that. I don't see that the text offers any support to that, but that is what I kept finding during the study. But it doesn't seem to be that she was in fear of him in any kind of way.
No, 'cause she invited him in.
Right. Yeah.
He didn't just run in. You know.
Yeah. No, it seems like she targeted him. She knew exactly who he was and what she wanted to do. Yeah. All right. And then verse 22. Now behold, Barak was pursuing Sisera, and Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, and I will show you the man who you are seeking." And he entered with her, and behold, Sisera was lying dead with a tent peg in his temple. So God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the sons of Israel. And the hand of the sons of Israel went forth heavier and heavier against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they had cut off Jabin, the king of Canaan. So what it's saying there is they kept rebelling against him to the point that he couldn't control them anymore. He was no longer oppressing them because they rebelled to the point that they were actually stronger. You see that they wiped out most of his army in just that one battle. Everybody that came out to fight, they did wipe out. And then we noticed, like Deborah said in verse 9, chapter 4, verse 9, the honor would go to a woman. And that woman we see is Jael instead of Barak, because Jael is the one that ended this battle, not Barak. Nevertheless, the Lord, it says in verse 23, the Lord is credited with subduing Jabin and the Canaanites. It says God subdued on that day. So we have that in perspective. So now, so that's the end of chapter 4. And now we go back in time. We remember in Numbers chapter 21, we got to this weird part where it said, "Is this not written in the book of the wars of the Lord?" And we look at each other and we go, I don't know. Is it? We don't know. We don't know that book. We don't have that book. We see references to that book, but the book itself we don't have. So we're about to get another reference to it. But before that, we'll go back in time. Numbers chapter 21, verses 14 and 15. This is one of the examples. It says, "Therefore it is said in the book of the wars of Yahweh, Waheb and Suphah, and the wadis of the Arnon, and the slope of the wadis that extends to the side of Ar and leans to the border of Moab." So what it's referencing doesn't apply to what we're studying. But we look at that because this is one of the examples of the book of the wars of the Lord being quoted in scripture. Even though we don't have that book, we have quotes from it and to it in scripture. So it seems like the book of the wars of the Lord, because of the examples that we do have, it seems like it was a songbook or a hymnal of war psalms or war hymns. They would sing when they go into battle. It'd be the same, like if we remember the Revolutionary War, or even the Civil War, we see the movies and we hear the stories, they would sing going into the battle, or when they were even on their march, they would sing while they're marching. So the reason why we're bringing that up is because Judges chapter 5 is one of those war songs, and people believe that it is one from that book. It is definitely a war hymn, but it's believed that it's from this book, this lost book. So Judges chapter 5 is Deborah singing a song about Judges chapter 4. So she is going to recite the events of Judges chapter 4 in a song format for Judges chapter 5. So it's mostly the same story over, but we do get some extra details that let us put together the story a little better. It's where we get some of the information to fill in the blanks for chapter 4. And it's really neat just how the style of the lyrics. So we're going to do a few verses at a time. I'm not going to sing it. It's not It's not a rhyming song since it's in Hebrew. It's going to be. It's not going to be as poetic in English, so we're just going to read it, right? So Judges chapter 5, verses 1 through 3 says, Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day, saying, When the leaders led in Israel, and when the people volunteered, bless Yahweh. Hear, O kings, give ear, O rulers. As for me, to Yahweh I will sing. I will sing praise to Yahweh, the God of Israel. So what we're going to pull out of that is in verse 3, notice that this message, this song, is for all of the rulers, all of the mighty people. Verse 3 says, Hear, O kings, give ear, O rulers. Well, she's not talking about the Israelites. They don't have a king or rulers. She's talking about the other nations. So she's saying, everybody listen. To Yahweh, I give praise. Okay? That's what she's saying. The commentary on Critical and Explanatory Bible says this about this passage. It says the meaning is obscurely seen in our version, but it has better rendered this. Praise. I'm going to clean it up in a kind of recent English. It'll say, Praise to Yahweh, for the free are freed in Israel. The people have willingly offered themselves. So that's what we're supposed to do. In the new covenant, right? We're supposed to willingly offer ourselves. Jesus says we have to pick up our cross and follow him. That doesn't mean be crucified. That means sometimes you have to pick up the hard, you have to do the hard thing. It's not easy doing the right thing. You have to pick up your cross to follow him. If it was, it's easy to do the wrong thing. It's hard to do the right thing. That's us picking up our cross. And that's us willingly offering ourselves, which is what she's talking about here. Verses 4 and 5 say, O Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth quaked. The heavens also dripped, even the clouds dripped water. The mountains flowed at the presence of Yahweh. This Sinai at the presence of Yahweh, the God of Israel. So that's interesting too, right? She's talking about the marching in the wilderness and how God physically marched with them for a time, and how he made it rain and how he made water flow from the mountains. We remember that at Sinai. So she's kind of leading up to where they are right now. Verse 6. In the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the paths had ceased. So travelers went by roundabout paths. So it was the apostasy and the wickedness got to the point where they couldn't even take the main roads. If you wanted to get city to city, people went back roads. You avoid the road pirates and the people that are robbing caravans and everything. So the travelers went by roundabout paths. Verse 7, the peasantry ceased. They ceased in Israel until I, Deborah, arose, until I arose a mother in Israel. God chose new leaders. Then war was in the gates. Not a shield or a spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Okay, so Judges happens in the time directly following Joshua, right? So the whole idea of Joshua was the conquest. They were supposed to take the promised land, right? And what they end up doing instead of taking the promised land was mixing in with all the pagan cultures around them. That's why they keep getting judged, is because instead of taking the land that they're supposed to and driving out the people that they're supposed to, they're mixing in with them. And then instead of spreading their influence over the other cultures, instead they are blending in with the other cultures, which is not what God wants. We also notice at the end of verse 8, not a shield or a spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Aren't they supposed to be at war? This is supposed to be the conquest right now. But there's no shields or spears, right? Because they're not fighting back. They've accepted their oppression because it's just easier. And they like this lifestyle, and they like the foreign women, and they like blending in. So no shields or spears, because they don't want to fight against these people, not till the oppression gets too bad, right? So verse 9, My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people. Bless Yahweh. You who ride on white donkeys, you who sit on rich carpets, and you who travel on the road, muse aloud. So, if you are at war, if you are participating in the conquest, if you have a animal to ride, you would ride a war horse, something that you could enter combat with. A white donkey is about as opposite of a war horse as you could possibly be. You're not riding a donkey of any color in a battle, and these white donkeys are this would be the very expensive. These would be for the elite class. Only the very rich people would have a white donkey. Certainly would never go to war with it. It also says, you who sit on rich carpets, right? So most of these tents are going to have just a dirt floor, right? Or they might have a sheepskin rug or whatever. But these rich carpets, probably purple thread. Again, people that are at war don't use these items, right? And she's saying she's directing this to those people that are happy with their rich and plushy lifestyle instead of doing what they're supposed to do. Verse 11, at the sound of those who divide flocks among the watering places, there they shall commemorate the righteous deeds of Yahweh, the righteous deeds for his peasantry in Israel. Then the people of Yahweh went down to the gates. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake, utter a song. Arise, Barak, and take away your captives, O son of Abinoam. Okay, so she's sarcastically pointing out that instead of war horses, they're riding white donkeys sitting on rich carpets. They've settled into their plushy lifestyle, and then she's saying, "Awake, right? It's time." And at the end, arise, Barak. Take away your captives. And those are the Israelites being oppressed, probably being made slaves from the Canaanite king. Verse 13, then survivors came down to the mighty ones. The people of Yahweh came down to me as warriors. So this is Deborah talking, right? The people of Yahweh came to her as warriors. Verse 14, from Ephraim, those whose root is in Amalek came down. Following you, Benjamin with your peoples. From Machir, commanders came down. And from Zebulun, those who wield the staff of a scribe. And the princes of Issachar were with Deborah, and was Issachar, so was Barak. Into the valley they rushed at his heels. Among the divisions of Reuben, there was great persistence of the heart, but they didn't go. So what she's doing here is she's pointing out which tribes joined the battle and which tribes decided not to. And what it's saying here is that among the divisions of Reuben, there was great persistence of the heart. So the tribe of Reuben, they thought about it. They thought about it a lot, but they didn't go. Verse 16, why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the whistling for the flocks? Among the divisions of Reuben, there were great probings of the heart. Gilead dwelt across the Jordan. And why did Dan stay in ships? Asher sat at the seashore and dwelt by its landings. So we see that none of them went. Verse 18, Zebulun was a place who despised their lives even to the death, and Naphtali also on the high places of the field. So Jesus talked like this too. When he said that these people despised their lives even to death, he didn't mean they hated themselves. He meant that they were willing to sacrifice themselves. So Zebulun and Naphtali fully went in and helped. They despised their lives even to death, which meant they were willing to fight and, if needed, die for this cause. But we see that some of these other tribes, notably Reuben, Gad, Dan, and Asher, didn't join the fight at all. The only two that we don't know from here is Judah and Simeon. We don't know what their position were. They're not brought up. Verse 19. The kings came and fought. Then fought the kings of Canaan at Tanakh, near the waters of Megiddo. They took no gain of silver, The stars fought from heaven. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The river of Kishon swept them away. The ancient river, the river Kishon. O my soul, march on with strength. So here's where we know, and we learned that in chapter 4, where we come to the idea that the chariots got stuck in the mud, that there was a heavy rain that the Lord caused, and threw everybody into a confusion. And this is where we grabbed the mud from, is because it says that the river Kishon fought against Sisera and swept them away. It seems like the rain came down, caused Kishon to overflow. It has low banks, and this was exactly where they were fighting. So it would have overflowed, caused the mud, the chariots get stuck, and so on. In verse 22, then the horse's hoofs beat from the dashing of his valiant steeds. Curse Meroz, said the angel of Yahweh. Utterly curse its inhabitants, because they did not come to the help of Yahweh against the warriors. Most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she of women in the tent. So that might sound familiar too, because we only ever hear that phrase mentioned about one other woman. Most blessed is she. Most blessed is she among women. Who are we talking about? It's Mary. So Mary's not the only one this is said about. So we can't use that verse to give Mary any sort of divinity. That would have to come from somewhere else. Most blessed of women is used to describe both of them. So unless we are also making Jael divine, we can't use that to make Mary divine. We'll move on. Verse 25. He asked for water, and she gave him milk. In a mighty bowl, she brought him curds, or some might say yogurt, right? It's warm milk is what it is. Verse 26. She sent forth her hand for the tent peg, and her right hand for the workman's hammer. Then she beat Sisera. She smashed his head. She crushed and pierced his temple. Between her feet he bowed, he fell, he lay. Between her feet he bowed, he fell. Where he bowed, there he fell, violently devastated. So that's pretty graphic, right? But we get the idea that she took the tent peg and the hammer, and one of the guys I heard say she gave Sisera a splitting headache. So that at the end of verse 27 switches from Deborah's description of those events. And then verses 28 to 30 is actually going to go to the point of view of Sisera's mother, as random as that sounds. So now Deborah is speaking from the point of view of Sisera's mother, starting in verse 28. Out of the window, she looked and lamented. Lamented it means cry or weep, right? She lamented. So out of the window, she looked and cried, the mother of Sisera through the lattice. Why does his chariot delay in coming? Why do the hoofbeats of his chariots tarry? So in other words, she's looking out the window, wondering what's taking him so long to get back. He's supposed to just go crush this Israelite rebellion and then come back. Verse 29, her wise princesses would answer her. Indeed, she repeats her words to herself. So this question that she's asking on what's taking so long, her princesses would answer her, and she would agree with. And here's that reason, verse 30. Are they not finding? Are they not dividing the spoil? A maiden, 2 maidens for every mighty man? To Sisera, a spoil of dyed work embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoil. Right? So she's saying that her princesses are telling her, and she's agreeing, that the delay is because this victory, the spoil, the rewards, the treasure that they're taking from this victory, they're dividing it up. And not only the gold or whatever else they find, but it says also, now this is Sisera's mom's princesses telling her. So Sisera's mom and her princesses are agreeing that this is what's taking so long. A maiden or 2 for every mighty man. So don't worry about it. It's no big deal. Sisera is just figuring out which maiden or 2 that he's going to take. And everybody seems to be okay with that. And then afterwards, well, certainly not the maidens. And then afterwards, the spoil of dyed work. This is clothing, right? And in those times, the color of the wool would normally be the material, probably, but the color of your garment would just be whatever the color was of the animal used. But the richer people that were a little better off could afford to color their clothes, color their garments, especially purple being the rarest one. That's why we always see royalty wearing purple, or very important people wearing purple. It doesn't mention that color on here, but this is what it's talking about, is having expensive clothing that they're taking from this victory, and they're dividing it, figuring out who gets what. Some of it might even be embroidered. It might say, "Look at me, I'm important," on the front. So that's what's taken so long. Don't worry. He'll be here shortly after they get done dividing up the gold and the women and the clothes. But that's not how it went. Verse 31 lets us know exactly how it went. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Yahweh, but let those who love him be like the rising of the sun in its might. All right. And the land was quiet for 40 years. It cannot be an accident that the quietness of the land keeps landing on 40s. It seems pretty obvious that this is another time of testing. The land is quiet for 40 years after this. Okay, it's the time of a generation. Will the next generation be obedient, or will they also apostatize? And next week, we'll answer that, but we already know.